Hi. We continue today in 1 Samuel 17 with David having arrived at the battle lines, responding to the command of his father Jesse to bring provisions to his brothers and to the commander of thousands. And here he is, we see in verse 20 on the left side, having risen early in the morning and arrived in the camp. So we're picking up in verse 21. And before we do, just to situate ourselves within the larger structure, you can see on the right side the chiastic shape of chapter 17. And we're continuing now in the C part here, in the purple part, David and his family. And as we've been looking at this whole section, the bold section that starts here and continues through here all the way down to here in verse 31, is in the Masoretic text, the Hebrew, MT, but not in the Greek text, the Septuagint, LXX. And so in the chiasm, there's two C parts parallel to each other in a sense, but the part here in 12 to 30 is the part that's only in the Masoretic text, and the part just in the C1 is in both the Greek and the Hebrew. So we're picking up here with David and his family in this section there. One of the things we're going to see about this section that's interesting, and Scholar Falkelman is the one who points it out, but I've made it in this little chart here, is how much this section is both people speaking, but speaking about speaking and speaking about hearing people speak. And so here are the examples of it in the section we're going to look at today, and also going down a little farther through verse 37. But as you can see at the bottom, not speaking or being spoken to is Yahweh. And David will only quote-unquote inquire of Yahweh at chapter 23, their first narrated exchange. I put it in quotes because even as we'll see there, the activity of inquiring and the text responds by saying Yahweh said, so it seems like they're having an exchange. But it may well be the kind of magical box, like a magic 8-ball we have today, where you ask a question to it and shake it and see what comes up. And it's almost always a yes or no answer. Should I go to war against so-and-so? And the text will say Yahweh says go to war against so-and-so. But many scholars have pointed out that seems to be one of those roll the dice kind of things. So even in chapter 23, David isn't actually having a living encounter with Yahweh, as we've seen Samuel have a number of times. And that will be important as we go. Another aspect of the chapter and this section is, as I was hinting at last time a little bit, is the transition of David from his father Jesse's son, who's now described as advanced in years, to something else. Will he be loyal to Saul, as they're servants of Saul, and the Israelite army is? Will he bypass Saul and be loyal to the people? Will he develop a relationship with Yahweh? And all those things are going to be in question as we go. And there are a number of details of the text that at least symbolically hint at David's movement, not just physically from one place to another, but politically, spiritually, and otherwise, away from one sense of loyalty to another. So let's pick this up in verse 21. As we do, I still have up a couple of the previous verses because the text is very confused about the sequence of battle. And you can argue that's about different sources, or you can argue the text is in the wrong order, quote unquote wrong, somebody's opinion of what should be the right order. Or we could argue that in a situation of war, things are confused. And let me point out what I'm talking about here. Back in verse 19, the narrator told us the men of Israel were in the valley fighting with the Philistines. But in the next verse we hear, when David comes to the encampment, the army was going forth to the battle line shouting the war cry. And then in the very next verse, the one we start with today, it says they drew up for battle. And the word for drew up here is to say to be preparing for battle, army against army, like they're just drawing up the battle lines, which we saw were already set in the beginning of the chapter. So whether this is different sources presenting them out of order, we could read this in exact reverse order, it would make perfect sense. They drew up for battle, they moved closer to the battle line, and then they began the fighting. But that's not the order of the text we have it in. So here we have it this way, and then we get to David here. For the first time, David is taking the initiative, and in a few verses we'll see David speak for the first time. It will be interesting what the text chooses to have as David's first reported speech. So the word for leaving the things in charge here is matching verse 20 as we saw up here. He left the sheep with the keeper. So he's gradually leaving behind the elements of his old life. He leaves the sheep with the keeper and left the things, which is to say the provisions that his father sent him to take, with the person in charge of the keeper, left it with the keeper of the baggage, literally in the hand of the keeper of the baggage or the household property. Again, this is underscoring a point I made earlier, that this same word Kelly was translated earlier as part of the phrase shield bearer. Both Goliath shield bearer and Saul or David's shield bearer, and that's overstating it. I've translated that just suggesting baggage assistant, and here's the reason for that: the keeper of the baggage. So he's shuffled off the sheep to a keeper and shuffled off the other things to another keeper, and yet he's still being faithful to his father. He brought the provisions as his father called, and he ran to the ranks as Jesse told him to run. And he went and greeted his brothers. So all these things he's done so far are fulfilling his father's command. But his father didn't say, do that and hurry back, although I'm sure his elderly father wants him to hurry back. However many kilometers, we can look back at the map and see, reminding that the distance between Bethlehem and Sokoh, as we saw last time, is like 28 kilometers that David seems to be going back and forth with, if not every day, at least frequently, to give his father the word. And so maybe he's just tired of running back and forth. But in the books of Samuel, we'll see many other runners. So certainly messengers running was the way word got taken across distance in a world before not only the internet, before telegraphs or telephones or trains or anything, or even the Pony Express. So now we're going to get into the sequence of talking. And that's where we see this here, this verbal sequence. So it starts with him talking to his brothers. And I've color-coded it here to see the shift that's going on. So David in blue and Saul in red, as you can see, and his family in orange, and then the people in green. Notice as we go through, the Israelites simply become the people, less identified with a specific place and perhaps with the monarchy as they were, leaving open the question of whose side will the people be on. And it will end with David speaking to Saul. So he starts off with his brothers and ends up speaking to Saul. Notice this goes across the part that's in the Septuagint as opposed to the Hebrew. So the Hebrew part ends here. But with the Masoretic text together, we see this transition from him talking to his brothers and first having listened to his father and his family to moving into the relationship with the people and with Saul as we go. So as we do that, we can look back and see some of the key words that will come out as we go here. So he went and greeted his brothers, offered them shalom here. And as we talk with them, and as Falkman notes here down below, as the text shifts from action to speech and words about speech, as David's unreported speech begins the passage, his reported speech ends it, and meanwhile the narrator refers to speaking 6 times. So that's what I tried to put in that chart. So as he talked with them, and it's not, this is presumably his brothers, then the champion, or as we saw before, the man in the middle, the man between is what the Hebrew word is here, and as almost always, the NRC omits the behold word, henna here, and behold. So the narrator is bringing this up to draw our attention back to while they're having this conversation. Oh, don't forget about Goliath. This is only the 2nd time he's named, and the last time he'll be named here. So as they talk to him, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath, his full title here, by name, the text includes by name, came up out of the ranks of the Philistines. Now, we'd seen earlier that he was there for 40 days taunting, so maybe we're supposed to understand he's going back and forth, just like David's going back and forth between the ranks and standing out there. So he came up here and went out of the ranks. Notice the wordplay in the Hebrew down below, Mima Arath, Mima Arechath. So literally, it's he came out of the cave. The word Marah can mean cave or otherwise hidden place. And we're going to find Saul and David encountering each other in caves a number of times. So perhaps that's anticipating what we'll see of that later. No caves are obviously in sight here, so the translation doesn't have it. It has him coming out of the ranks, but that's not literally what the text says in the Hebrew. So it came out of the cave into the ranks and then spoke the same words as before. And we'll see this phrase a number of times where the narrator is simply narrating that the same words were spoken without actually narrating them being spoken again. And that's really emphasizing the level of conversation, but also who's asking the question, who's hearing whom? David heard him. And we'll pay attention to who hears whom as we go. So now all the Israelites, notice not the Judahites. When the chapter started, we'd heard that representatives of Judah also sent soldiers, but Saul is not a king and has no authority over Judah, so now it's the Israelites in relation to Saul on the question of a champion from them who will take on Goliath. So that's who we're hearing speaking. So when they saw the man, as opposed to heard in verse 11, they heard him taunting them there, and that's what made them afraid. Ironically, they were not described as afraid when they saw him coming up with all his armor and weapons. They were afraid when they heard him threaten, and now that he's speaking, they're afraid of what they saw. So there's definitely some behind-the-scenes humor here, and that's also included in some of the puns and wordplay. I can't point out all of them, but there's a lot of that going on. So the Israelites, when they saw the men, fled from him, just as the Philistines will flee in verse 51 at the end. And we're very much afraid. So it's the second time we're hearing they're afraid. And where's Saul in this? It was the Israelites and Saul were afraid, but Saul's no longer even in the picture. And that's an important thing here, as we'll see. The people are just out there. They're going to talk about the king in this verse, but Saul is actually not there. And let me put up the verbal encounters here so we can see how this sequence goes. So here is where they seem to be talking amongst themselves or to each other. The Israelites said here, have you, who's the you, they're talking to? They're, again, speaking amongst each other. Have you seen this man? I highlighted last time the use of this demonstrative pronoun, ze, here, which has a negative connotation, not always, but a lot of times. So in terms of being somebody rough, it's part of the othering of Goliath and the Philistines that we've seen throughout. So surely he has come up to defy Israel. One of the many surelys in 1 Samuel, and we see a number there. But he's already said that. There's no question. He's already named in verse 10 that that is his intention. We noticed at the time that the Hebrew word for defy, which is one of our key words from our passage, can also mean to shame and disgrace. And so that's what they're worried about here. And then we hear this promise from the king that we didn't hear from the king. We only hear it indirectly here. So as Fackelman notes, Saul is not mentioned by name here or in the following verses. And Fackelman says, Saul can no longer lead or offer deliverance. He too is paralyzed at the sight of the giant. And so we hear this reward here, and notice how folklorish it is here. It's as if, what will be the reward for somebody who kills the dragon? And Goliath is portrayed as not that different than a dragon. Greatly enrich here. So the word for enrich, the king will greatly enrich, Osher here, but otherwise, only Yahweh makes rich, as we heard back in Hannah's song back in chapter 2. So whether Yahweh's power is in the king or not, and Yahweh's part of this, we don't know. Using one of our keywords, who kills him here, and we can see that from the keywords up here back in our section. So right here, give him his daughter and make his family free. The king giving the hero his daughter is, whether this is out of Greek myth, as we've seen the connections, or out of much wider myth, ancient or more recent, we can certainly recognize that as the prize. But the fact that this is what they tell, and David hears it and asks about it, is key. The promise of reward, not of good standing in Yahweh's mind or even good standing in the king's mind, but wealth, a wife, and free. And there's an irony here, perhaps, in the use of free. Why are they not free already? The word that's used here, make his family free, hafshi, is used in Exodus for debt slavery and also Deuteronomy for debt slavery. So that seems to be the implication here, that people who are in debt, the king will have released from the debts. But we hadn't known about anything about that. We hadn't known that Saul's seemingly very low-scale monarchy even had any kind of debt system, or that people were complaining about debt. But there it is sneaking in, because of course that might not be something that a king would want to be proclaiming, that he's being enriched or that his people are being enriched on loans to the ordinary people. So there's a promise of debt freedom, of a daughter, and of wealth of some other kind. But then we see a surprising thing here. In verse 26, David asks the very question that was just answered, again suggesting perhaps things out of order, but this is the order we have it. So we see here in verse 26, as Alter notes, his very first word spoken expresses wanting to know what will be gained. The inquiry about personal profit is then immediately balanced or covered up by the patriotic pronouncement. But of course it's not covered up because both are in the text. And what it's highlighting here is how people who want to become enriched can claim God's on their side in wanting to do that. Whether those are megachurch pastors in our time or colonial powers that claim the church's side throughout Western history, or others. As we well know, and this is a key part of this entire book, just because people claim God's on their side doesn't mean it's so. And I really want to underscore that this text throughout will have David claiming that God is with him, but just because he says so doesn't mean it's true. There have to be other criteria by which one can decide whether the real creator God is with somebody or not just the claim that they say they are. But monarchies often do that, and that's one reason I'm spending so much time on these stories, is I think they resonate with issues that have continued throughout history into our own time. So he said to the men who stood by him, and there's a wonderful ambiguity there. Does that mean just the bystanders or people who were with him? But why would anybody be with David at this point? He's simply a shepherd boy who's come with as an running errands for his father. We know nothing else about him other than, if we include chapter 16, that he can play the lyre and soothe the king's evil spirit. Whether that's in view or not, or whether this is simply to be read separately, isn't clear, although we'll see in the next video why there is suggest some link that Saul already perhaps knows David, and by the end of the chapter that he doesn't again. So he said to those who stood by him, "What shall be done?" And as Bodner notes here below, by asking a question, he's actually making a statement. I would argue, says Bodner, that David's political consciousness is here unveiled. Such timing and opportunity will be a hallmark of David's career, which is to say that right at the start, he's looking for personal advantage. But at the same time, notice what will be done for the man who kills us and takes away the reproach from Israel. So is he concerned with taking away the reproach from Israel, or do you think taking away the reproach from Israel is a way to be personally rewarded? He's assuming that there's some offer out there, and of course there is. Notice again this Philistine, as we just saw, and reproach here, herpa, another word for disgrace, similar to the word for defy that we saw. So now for the first time we hear him othered, Goliath, that is othered as uncircumcised, ha'arel, and again in verse 36. As Bailey notes, could be a way of claiming that from the Israelite perspective, the Philistines were not true warriors because they were not able to sustain the pain of the operation of genital mutilation, which is an interesting thought. If it's done on your 8th day, as the Bible suggests it should be, commands that it should be, I'm not sure what sustaining the pain of the operation would mean. But Bailey's point is an interesting one. And the sentence continues, who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? Notice the question of who is he? So David has asked two questions here. What will be the reward, and who is this Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? The phrase living God is only here in 1 Samuel or 2 Samuel. It's once in Deuteronomy, once in Joshua, and a couple of times in Kings. And one might wonder if David believes in a living God. Notice it doesn't say Yahweh here, that he might have some relationship with that living God, but nothing of that is narrated. And we'll see now as we continue down just a couple of more verses. I highlighted the same way here to show the little chiasm that takes place here in this little section here in 27:30. The people answered him in the same way, and again they spoke in the same. People answered him in the same way down there. And so in the middle will be the relationship with his brother. So let's just continue through that here. So notice how the Israelites have now become the people. And that's framed here with the people, the only two places they are highlighting the chiastic unit there. Notice this is another example of, this is literally the same words, not the same way in the same words. How many times do we hear here people, the narrator saying that people are saying the same words? But here they're actually narrated. The words are, so shall it be done for the man who kills him. And then we have this interjection from Eliab, his brother. Notice that the word for eldest here is the greatest, and the word for youngest for David was the smallest. So his greatest brother Eliab heard him talking to the man, and his anger was kindled. And one might wonder at first, why is he angry? Notice the other anger we're already seen and will see in 1 Samuel. We saw Saul's anger that led him to battle. We saw Samuel's anger about Saul. We'll see Saul angry again a couple of times, once at his son Jonathan and then at David. We'll see Abner angry. And there's more as we go. So anger will motivate, as it often does in male power situations. So Eliab's anger was kindled against David, against his little brother. Is this more than just sibling jealousy? And notice what he says. Why have you come down? We already know the answer is he came down because his dad told him to. And Eliab should know that. The provisions are there. And then he asks another question. With whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? To denigrate his little brother, as if all you had to do was take care of a few sheep, and you couldn't even do that. The phrase for in the wilderness omits another hint of, behold, right between the sheep and the pasture or wilderness, the midbar there. So left those few sheep, behold, in the wilderness, like you couldn't even carry out your task, although we know he has. And he says, I know your presumption and the evil of your heart. And this pair is only here in the Masoretic text, but the word presumption here, zadon, is only here in the Deuteronomistic history, 11 times in the Masoretic text. But the phrase evil of your heart, the roa here, only here in 1 and 2 Samuel. It contrasts with the evil spirit now in Saul. But do we take Eliab as speaking the truth? Is there evil in David's heart? What do we know about David's heart? We looked in chapter 16 at a table that showed all the details that have been described about David, at least what people have narrated. But are any of these true? Are these observers of David reliable narrators, either in the sense are they speaking the truth they know, or they're being misled by him? In this case, there's no reason to think that Eliab is anything other than an angry brother dissing on his younger brother. Does it really tell us anything about David's heart? We'll have to see as we go. His accusation is, you've come down just to see the battle. Now we know that's not true. He came down in obedience to Jesse, but why not come down to see the battle? If your brothers are at war and you're concerned about them, if nothing else, you might want to see the battle, but also your nation is under threat. Is it his nation? That's another question. There's no reason to think David identifies with Israel, but he claims God even though he didn't claim Yahweh. So a lot of ambiguity at this early stage in the confused state of this story where we're not sure of who's going where and which order. And then we hear David responds. The New RSV has, "What have I done? It was only a question." And as the note from Fackelman suggests here, the translation mars the point of David's dabar, which is the word for word. David appears as someone who minimizes his own contribution. That is not in keeping with the portrait that the text gives him, what I gives him, and gives of him, I'm sorry. And Fackelman suggests instead, "What have I done wrong? Isn't this the matter then?" And he uses an example from Numbers for the phrase "and dabar" as nothing up or no problem, as opposed to it was only a question. Like there's literally, as Polzin notes, this last phrase means, is it not a word? Which means, is it not a word? Yes, it is a word. And so finally we'll end here with, he turned away from him and toward another and spoke in the same way. And I'd like to suggest that this is symbolic of his moving away from his family toward the monarchy, or perhaps toward the people as a source of belonging and authority. He's been anointed as king with Yahweh's authority via Samuel, but it takes the people's affirmation, and that's going to take the whole rest of the book to achieve one way or another. And yet here it says the people answered him as before, not affirming their loyalty to him, but that the current king, Saul obviously, will reward the person who kills David. And so, I'm sorry, who kills Goliath, not who kills David. Later, Saul might want to reward someone who kills David, but right now we're talking about killing Goliath. So David has found angry resistance from his brother, older brother, but at least an open response from the people, and that's where we'll pick it up next time.